The coronavirus has brought the global economy into a complete halt in the beginning of 2020. Economic conditions worsened substantially across key economies around the world, including the US, China, the European Union. The three collectively account for more than half of the world's economy. This year, dubbed as the Great Lockdown, is expected to be the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of the late 1920s. As the chart illustrates, most of the world was in deep and synchronized recession in the first quarter of this year. Among large economies, Russia was the exception, but this is mainly because Russia had its COVID outbreak relatively later than others. Unsurprisingly, the decline in economic activity was mainly due to widespread lockdowns, as businesses and factories had to remain shut, while consumer movements were confined and restricted. By the end of the first quarter, slightly over 60 countries around the world had imposed some form of curfew or lockdown. And by the end of April, almost 4 billion people, or slightly over half of the world's population, were subject to complete or partial lockdown. In the first half of this year, nearly all the global population was affected by some form of containment measure. This is quite unprecedented. Given our unique data assets at Visa, we have developed a COVID-19 impact index that captures the economic impact across different countries in real time. The index blends 9 key indicators across the spectrum of disease incidence and transmission, travel and logistics, cross-border movement of goods, people and services, domestic activity, confidence, and economic indicators that have tended to lead the cycle. Each of the components is scored based on its current growth rate compared to its 3-year average. So we generally score value as strong if they're stronger than their long run average, weak if they're weaker than their long run average, and neutral or yellow in this case if they are in line with their long run average. As of our latest reading of the index, the world is still reeling from the economic damage, with most of the countries still in orange or dark red, highlighting the severe economic consequences of the virus. China's improvement in disease incidence has allowed it to transition to yellow. This was also supported by the strong growth in Chinese exports in April, which rose 8.2% year over year due to strong demand from Southeast Asia. But it's not all gloom and doom. Recent economic data suggests that the worst is probably behind us, and there is some glimmer of cautious hope. If we look at the left chart, which shows the purchasing manager indices across key economies, where any point above 50 means the economy is expanding compared to the preceding month, and any point below 50 means the economy is contracting, we can see that China is slightly ahead of the curve and is already showing signs of encouraging rebound. Latest economic data also confirm the story, showing that the Chinese economy grew by 3.2% year over year in the second quarter this year. The European Union and the United States are still in contraction mode, as they remain below 50 as of June. But they're likely to pick up again for the upcoming months as governments move to ease restrictions and lift lockdowns. Though there is some fear that rising infection rates, especially in the US, could delay plans to reopen the economy in certain states. The key takeaway from the first chart is that the economic activity has probably bottomed out and should continue to recover thereafter. I find the next chart very interesting. I think a lot of analysts thought it would take time for people to feel comfortable again to go out, to dine in restaurants. But some data is quite encouraging. We're going to look at year-over-year percentage change in restaurant booking for dining in. In the US, as the chart shows, it's still negative, but it's been trending up and passed its worst in April. What's quite surprising, in Australia, we went back to positive before a renewed rise in infection rates, especially in Melbourne, caused the government to tighten restrictions again. That's where you see the second and third dips. Encouragingly for Germany, we are more or less approaching pre-pandemic levels with positive year-over-year growth in bookings. This could mean that certain categories of spend may be on a faster path to recovery than we had initially feared and thought. We have also identified 15 leading countries around the world based on two main criterion, where number one, the disease seems to be relatively under control, and number two, economic activity is gradually picking up. We're going to look at a heat map that captures the percentage of small and medium enterprises which have reopened based on our unique Visa data assets. So we essentially looked at whether merchants' point of sale terminals were active again to estimate what percentage of businesses have reopened. Dark blue in this case means more than 90% of SMEs in a given country are open, while dark orange means less than 50% of SMEs are open. As we can see across these countries, 80 to 90% of SMEs were open and active in January and February. But once the lockdowns were enacted, many businesses had to shut doors and close, especially in late March and early April. By the end of June, more and more businesses have reopened as government eased restrictions in these countries. From our region, the UAE stands out, but we're still far from a full return to business as usual, as we're still at around 60 to 70% of SMEs that reopened again. Europe in particular seems to be doing well compared to the rest of the world, with countries such as Germany, France, Switzerland at the forefront. Economic conditions in the largest economies in Central Europe, the Middle East, and Africa pretty much followed the global trends. Reminder, for the Purchasing Managers Index, any point above 50 means economic expansion and growth, while any point below 50 means economic contraction and decline. In Russia, there was a sharp drop to historical low in April due to lockdowns and containment measures, followed by a minor rebound in May and June as the government moved to ease these restrictions. Saudi, UAE, and South Africa saw a less sharp drop in April, followed also by a minor rebound in May, with further gains in June, reflecting continued improvement. The UAE in particular seems to be doing relatively well, with the economy making a gradual return to growth in June by crossing the 50 mark, though only marginally. Economic conditions were also supported by the recovery in oil prices, which were propped up by the OPEC Plus agreement, including Saudi and Russia, to limit the global oil supply in their efforts to rebalance the energy market. Oil prices as of lately were around $44 per barrel. While far from ideal, as they are still far below the budgetary requirement for most oil exporters in our region, the prices are much better than the lows we've seen in April. One notable distinction when it comes to the coronavirus is that experiences have varied from one country to another, and countries are in different stages of the pandemic. For example, among the large economies in CEMEA, Russia is still seeing a high number of new cases, notably in late July when the country witnessed another peak. Saudi is similarly struggling to rein in the spread of the virus, but encouragingly, the curve has been trending downward recently. More positively, the number of new cases is relatively stabilizing in the UAE, while alarmingly in South Africa, we continue to see strong spikes in the number of new daily cases. By looking at the stringency index for key CEMEA countries, which was developed by Oxford University and captures the stringency of government measures such as school closures, enforcement of lockdowns, border controls, flight restrictions, and so on, we can see the rapid rise in the indices in late March as governments scrambled to control the virus. But since late May, early June, many of the governments have continued to ease these restrictions, paving the way for the gradual economic recovery. Encouragingly as well, we are seeing a gradual return to normalcy as mobility and people's movement across key regional economies is picking up. We're looking at mobility across different activities and how they changed relative to the beginning of this year, i.e., before the coronavirus spread to those countries. It's important to mention that lockdown and easing measures have varied across countries. Let's take the top left chart as an example. First, it's important to highlight when the lockdown was imposed, which was around late March in UAE's case. And the lockdown measures were eased by late April. So as people's movement were restricted, they stayed at home more compared to pre-corona, as the orange line shows. Visits to grocery and pharmacies dropped but remained relatively more resilient, as the dark gray line shows. Visits to restaurants, cafes, and shopping centers were obviously among the worst hit, as shown in the blue line. Then visits to workplaces dropped as well, as many offices were forced to close down, and working from home became the norm. Finally, visits to national parks and public beaches also dropped significantly. The story is more or less similar in Saudi, aside from the notable drop in Eid when more restrictions were in place. In Russia's case, again, it's more or less very similar trends, with the exception of strong growth in visits to parks, mainly because the comparison is to January when the weather is cold. So it does make sense that visits to parks and beaches are more frequent in June and July. Finally, South African trends didn't diverge much either. The key takeaway from this slide are twofold. Number one, while visits to grocery, retail, and workplace are still lower than the beginning of the year in most cases, they've been trending up and slowly getting closer to normal. And number two, in the four countries under consideration, people started social distancing before their government instated any lockdown policies. So the economic damage from the coronavirus was going to be significant regardless of government's responses. This is further supported by evidence from Sweden, where consumer behavior was more or less similar to the rest of the world, even though the government did not impose any lockdown there. So people's perception of risk is as important as government policy, and we're unlikely to see strong recovery until the pandemic situation is under control. If you keep up with the business news, I'm sure by now you've heard of all the different types and shapes of recovery: V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped, W-shaped, and so on. I think it's important to first understand what each means, starting with the most optimistic scenario, the V-shaped recovery. On the horizontal axis, we have time. On the vertical axis, we have GDP. And as you remember from your Macro 101 class, GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. So the assumption is that there will be a minor hit to the economy, loss of output due to lockdowns, swift and immediate rebound, and we're back to the long-term trajectory of GDP level. Then there's the Nike swoosh-shaped recovery, where there's an initial hit to output followed by a slow and gradual recovery. And again, we eventually return to the long-run GDP level. The loss of output in this case is more significant compared to the V-shaped recovery. Then there's the W-shaped, where there's again an initial loss of output followed by a swift recovery as economies open up. But in this case, we're hit with a second wave of the virus, forcing countries to reimpose lockdowns again, and we lose output one more time before returning back to normal GDP level. Moving to even more pessimistic scenarios, the U-shaped recovery, the loss of output in this case is quite significant, and it takes a long time for us to return to normal. The gloomiest and most pessimistic scenario is the L-shaped one, where there is a permanent damage to the global economy's capacity to produce goods and services, essentially meaning we never return to our normal GDP level. One of the most common questions is then, what's the likely shape of recovery? Well, it's not an easy question to answer because the shape of recovery will depend on the economic structure and which sectors dominate that economy. For example, countries that rely on travel and tourism will see much more damage to their economy than others and much slower recovery. The magnitude of the negative impact of COVID has varied from one industry to another. As an example, groceries and essentials are on one side of the spectrum, i.e. among the least affected, while airlines and hotels were on the other side, i.e. among the most affected. Therefore, the recovery timeline is expected to vary by spending category. In a study by our marketing team, consumers were asked about their expectation of how long it would take for spending to return to normal for each category once the coronavirus crisis is over. A dark green box means the recovery should be within a month, while a red box means more than 7 months. Each number in the box represents the number of months to recovery. In the UAE's case, as an example, consumers expect spending on grocery and supermarkets to return to normal within less than 2 months, while for international business travel, it is more than 6 months. The story is more or less similar among key economies in SEMEA, including Saudi Arabia and Russia. Essentials such as grocery and supermarket are expected to be first to recover, ranging from 0 to 2 months. Then spend on cinemas, events, and staycations, ranging from 4 to 7 months for recovery. Finally, international travel, which is expected to take quite some time to recover, ranging from 5 to more than 8 months. So overall, discretionary categories are expected to see much slower normalization in spend as consumers prioritize essentials. Not only that consumers are reprioritizing their spending, but they're also rethinking their preferred payment method. On the left, we have the payment method, such as cash or cash on delivery, different types of cards, contactless, mobile payments, etc. Consumers were surveyed about their usage of these payment methods, whether they increased, decreased, or stayed the same. A positive number or a dark blue box in this case means more consumers raised their usage of a particular payment method, while a negative number or an orange box means more consumers decreased their usage of that payment method. For example, in the UAE, consumers shifted their spending more to contactless, mobile payments, and cards, including prepaid debit and credit. Cash usage declined in parallel as it's considered less safe and hygienic compared to other payment methods. Again, the story isn't too different in the other regional economies with less cash usage and more spending on cards, mobile payments, and contact. It's very likely that this behavioral shift will prove durable and more long-term rather than just temporary, as consumers realize the benefit of experiencing seamless and frictionless payments through mobile payments and contactless. The coronavirus has also accelerated the digital shift and compressed years' worth of digital transformation into just a few months. With many restrictions on movement and mobility, business closure due to lockdown and so, consumers had to shift their spending from brick and mortar to online channels. Some of them for the very first time, while merchants had to swiftly adjust their offering to include digital channels to survive. The light blue bar shows the percentage of consumers who will continue shopping online after COVID is contained for each country and spending category. The dark blue bars show the percentage of consumers who will continue shopping online, but less often, while the yellow bar shows the percentage of consumers who will go back to brick and mortar post-COVID. Most consumers plan to continue shopping online across different categories even after COVID, some of them less often than before. But the main takeaway is that we're very likely to see sustained acceleration in digital spending as consumers realize the benefits and convenience of online shopping. For example, 37% of consumers in the UAE plan to continue shopping for grocery online even after COVID is contained. Travel and tourism has been among the worst hit industries by the coronavirus, and the disruption is likely to have long-term ramifications for the industry. Given the data availability issues, the first chart focuses only on a few major international airports, but clearly illustrates the challenges global travel has faced before and after previous crises. SARS and swine flu were both health emergencies, and you can see that generally the impact was short-lived, lasting about 3 months before a trough in growth was hit, and then a gradual recovery. September 11 was a bit more profound as it led to a whole new way the world managed security on airplanes and airports. Additionally, the fear for safety took passengers well over a year to recover. This combination of fear and regulatory uncertainty is what contributed in part to the longer recovery back in 2001. Such a similar situation exists today, which is why we think COVID in terms of length of recovery will be as long, if not longer, than September 11 for aviation. The depths of this shutdown are unprecedented, as fear has taken its toll on travelers' willingness to travel. Further complicating things is the regulation, which have been successfully tightened over the past 5 months, from no COVID-19 restrictions all the way to a complete ban on all inbound travel, which is what 2/3 of all countries have applied. Reversing these closures will take time, and which will replace them and prevent the international import of new cases be seen. It's not only policy restrictions that are hindering travel, but also consumers are still cautious about cross-border international travel. A June survey by the International Air Transport Association found 3 in 10 people would wait at least 1 month before traveling again if things were contained, while 5 out of 10 people said they would wait between 6 to 12 months before traveling again. The survey also found an interesting behavioral shift. If we look at the number of days between booking date and travel date, most people plan their trips way in advance in May 2019, booking their trip more than 20 days before their actual date of their flight. For now, however, with so much uncertainty and flight restrictions still in place in many countries, it seems people are booking their flights way closer to travel date, as it shows for May 2020 bookings. By looking at recent development in international travel, inbound arrivals was projected to grow by an average of 4 to 5% over the next few years if we look at the pre-corona forecast. But obviously, with so many travel restrictions still in place, dire economic conditions among emerging markets and advanced economies, and the significant hit to consumer confidence, now it's projected to have from around 1.4 billion arrivals in 2019 to just over 700 million in 2020. What's more, we are not expected to return to the same level of travelers in 2019 until at least 2023, according to some estimates. At this stage, there is still a lot of uncertainty, which compromises the quality of the forecast, but it seems the consensus among major organizations that normal cross-border travel won't return to normal till 2023 and beyond. But encouragingly, hotel occupancy rates relative to the same period last year have been gradually trending up in key economies around the world. Latest figures for China for the second week of July was close to 70% of the same period last year. For other regions as well, such as Asia Pacific, excluding China, Europe, and the US, this has also been trending up. While again, we're still far from full recovery, the worst is probably behind us. And all hope is not lost. If we look at the number of commercial flights worldwide, they plunged from more than 100,000 per day in January to just over 25,000 in mid-April. However, the number of flights in the past few weeks has been gradually trending up, and it's past the worst period. One of the interesting findings from various surveys suggests that as international flight restrictions remain in place in various parts of the world, and as people still feel uncomfortable about international travel, domestic tourism and staycations are becoming more popular. We wanted to see what cities are likely to see a relatively faster rebound. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at cities' reliance on international tourism. The further to the right, the more reliance on international arrivals, especially long-haul flights. On the vertical axis, it shows domestic arrivals as a percentage of total. So the further up means the city is more popular for domestic tourism. This means cities such as Shanghai, Tokyo, and Cape Town are relatively in a better position to weather the disruption because they have higher share of domestic tourism than Dubai, Riyadh, New York, and Abu Dhabi. Another interesting development is the emergence of travel bubbles. It's important to first define what's a travel bubble, which is a partnership between neighboring countries that have successfully contained the virus. This means they can establish a safe corridor between themselves without restrictive policies such as on-arrival quarantines and so on. A number of notable bubbles have formed, including the European Union, among the Baltic states such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and between China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. And there are many neighboring countries discussing the possibility of establishing safe travel bubbles. Negotiations to form the bubbles to facilitate the return of cross-border travel could be expanded to include more countries that have achieved a similar level of success in containing the coronavirus. We estimate travel bubbles that are being currently discussed could allow at most the return of 15% of travelers. And if this experience of travel bubbles proved successful, then it could be expanded to include more and more countries, paving the way for recovery. To illustrate the travel bubbles, let's consider Paris as an example. The city welcomed 16 million arrivals in the summer of last year. And instead of completely missing out on these tourism receipts, the city can start welcoming tourists from those origin markets where the virus seems to be under control. This could add up to almost 10 million arrivals for Paris from travel bubbles, safe short and long-haul origin markets. In Dubai's case, there are no established travel bubbles yet between the UAE and other countries. But we estimate that arrivals from origin markets where the virus seems to be contained could add up to 2.3 million visitors. For destinations in Europe, such as Paris, Prague, and Athens, where short-haul travel is dominant, this could be enough to restart their travel industries. However, for destinations such as Sydney, Singapore, or Dubai, which are more dependent on long-haul visitors, the road to recovery may involve more investment to restore consumer confidence. So while we're still far from full normalization in cross-border travel, travel bubbles could initiate the first steps to a long road to full recovery. This was the SEMIA Economic Update session. Thanks a lot for joining me. We will ensure to make you updated with any recent developments in our markets.